Good morning and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. So like most cities across the nation, San Antonio has been hit hard by COVID-19 and all of the devastating economic and public health consequences that have followed it. And thousands of residents in the second largest city in Texas are just one missed paycheck, one unexpected expense away from financial ruin. And the winter storms that ripped through Texas last month have only compounded what was already a deeply precarious situation for so many people living there. And in the middle of all of this hardship and suffering, the city has held firm onto its approach to over-policing. Last year, officials passed a 2021 budget that featured no major cuts to the police department, which seemingly ignored the demands by local advocates following the killing of George Floyd. And this week, we're getting some new polling from Data for Progress and the Lab, a project of The Appeal, on what people in the city want their elected officials to do. So here are just a few of the findings. 76% of likely voters in Bexar County support a one-time cash payment to help compensate the households most impacted by the recent winter storms. 71% of likely voters support community-based programs to prevent violence, models that have shown to be effective in other jurisdictions, and that operate at just a fraction of the cost of policing. And 64% of likely voters would support the use of non-police responders to mental health-related or substance use crises. So the question now is how officials will respond to findings like these. And by the way, I'm learning that it is Bexar County, not Bexar County. My apologies. So joining me now to discuss exactly that is San Antonio Councilman Roberto Trevino. Thank you so much for joining us here today. It's really a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be here with you this morning.
So, Council Member, I want to start out by asking about some of these survey results. So what really struck me was the overwhelming support for direct cash payments to people who need them the most. And there were three areas where we saw this sort of support. So in addition to the result that I mentioned at the top, which was that 76% of likely voter support payments for those who have been affected by winter storms, the poll also found that 60% support monthly payments to young adults transitioning out of foster care, and 50% support providing payments to people who have been incarcerated and are returning to society. So talk to us about where you stand on these proposals.
Well, it's very much in line with the very things we've been fighting for over the last year and a half, especially as we've gotten into this pandemic. One of the things that we highlight on this city council is a lot of the issues that we're facing are actually not caused by the pandemic, but are rather highlighted by the pandemic. The socioeconomic disparity that we have in this city was already an existing issue. The pandemic only helped to highlight that even further. And I think that one of the biggest concerns that I had is that we're focusing a lot of our dollars that we are getting and applying during this pandemic towards future planning, towards things that are not addressing the current emergency. And so we've worked with housing advocates, we've worked with attorneys that have, like the Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, that have helped us to really be a voice for those who are facing potential issues like eviction, who are living on a razor's edge, and really want to highlight the need for direct cash assistance. And so, this is something that we'll keep fighting for. We believe that's what we need to address today. The emergency is today, not tomorrow, not in the future. And so as we're getting funds, as we have resources available to us as a city, we believe that we should be applying them to those who are in need today.
So now that we know that you're in support of these proposals, talk to us a little bit about how we make them happen. How does it get over the finish line? How do we get it passed? What are the mechanisms to do that? And how do you plan to advocate for those?
Well, we early on we established different pillars at the city of San Antonio to address a lot of these concerns, and One of them was housing and the insecurity that we knew it was going to cause during the pandemic. We need to apply and prioritize, I should say, the different pillars that are about the emergency. One of the pillars was workforce development, which I think a lot of us or all of us are for. It's just that we put way too much into workforce development, and it crowded out funds and resources out of emergency housing assistance. And so, what we need to do is help to highlight what the emergency is today, and allow us to have a discussion about moving monies around to help those that are in need now. And we currently have an example that where we move some of the money out of the workforce plan that was just sitting in a bank account, quite frankly, and we moved about $14 million out of there to go help create a worker relief program for the food and beverage industry and hospitality workers, because those folks are suffering. And by creating this program, it helps them to pay the bills, helps them to get direct cash assistance, it helps them to address the current emergency. But what's happening is the city, along with certain council members and the mayor, are focused on programs that are for future planning and like the workforce. And I don't think we should be doing anything that is not addressing the emergency today, and even worse, allowing the city to simply just hold money in a bank account, and we're talking about millions and millions of dollars that are sitting there waiting to be utilized.
Because what's the point of having that money sitting there if people can't benefit from it right now?
Well, that's the biggest issue we had early on. We have an emergency relief fund. Some call it a rainy day fund, and it's well over $100 million. The city's never actually tapped into it, but early on, when we were approaching this pandemic, we talked about utilizing that emergency relief fund or emergency fund to tap into our resources to help those who are in most need. There's a lot of people that are facing potential eviction, a lot of folks who have a lot of anxiety because they are not getting the assistance that they would like or need. And so we broached that subject as one example. But again, when we got money from the feds, we created a COVID relief plan, and we created these different pillars. Within one of those pillars, we put $75 million towards a workforce program that was struggling to spend the money. And so I think that unfortunately that's just the wrong approach to think that there's all these other pillars, including the emergency housing pillar, that could use that money that houses the direct cash assistance, and yet we're sort of have this other pillar where we're struggling to find ways to spend $75 million. On top of that, we created another program through a 1 cent sales tax initiative to further increase that workforce program. Again, a worthy program, but what you have as a result is money that sits in a bank account waiting to be spent, while others are just simply waiting for assistance.
So I want to switch to talk about one area where arguably too much money is spent, and that's policing. And I want to turn to some more polling results. So new polling from the Appeal also reveals support for reforms to policing in San Antonio. Mm-hmm. And on the reform front, 80% of likely voters support public transparency for contract negotiations between the San Antonio Police Department and the City of San Antonio. And 50% of likely voters support legislation that would repeal the San Antonio Police Department's collective bargaining rights in order to increase officer accountability. So what's your take on these two initiatives?
Well, yeah, again, it's interesting as you brought it up. I mean, in the middle of a pandemic, we are also we saw a lot of folks come out and protest and express their concern over the way we police our city, and that's a big deal because 2/3 of our entire budget as a city goes towards the public safety apparatus. So it really does impact us in so many ways. And most people don't fully understand or realize that every city service that you can think about when you ask about like trash pickup or how parks are maintained, if we can repair a pothole, all that happens in that last third. And so having a discussion about police reform is so critical, especially when it comes to sort of the moral obligations that we have to really lessen the anxiety that the many citizens are feeling around the way we tackle this issue. Currently, there is a negotiation happening with the police contract, and it's the police union is currently negotiating their next 5-year plan, and they've talked about how they want to complete this plan here very soon. They proposed getting a contract agreement sometime this week, which would essentially undermine the vote May 1st that's on the ballot. As you mentioned, the Fix SAPD folks have collected enough signatures to get the vote on ballot initiative, and I feel that we as a council should not be voting on something that undermines a vote on May 1st, which is the will of the people, and therefore should wait until afterwards to see about how we approach the contract negotiations moving forward. I want to say I am supportive of the 10 points that have been brought up by Fix SAPD in terms of accountability and human rights. And so, I mean, accountability is just simply non-negotiable. And we're seeing many cities across the country tackle this issue. We know that there is a need to address this issue head on.
And when you're having conversations with your colleagues about all of these measures, what is that conversation looking like? Do you think San Antonio is going to see these sorts of reforms in the near future?
Well, it's difficult to say. I think the mayor recently signaled that he was supportive of the union's right to collectively bargain for their contract, which I think left a lot of us a little confused about sort of the purpose of that in the middle of a negotiation. I don't know why we would signal anything like that, knowing that there is a ballot initiative as well. So I think that we as a city council still have a lot to discuss, and the issue is really right in front of us with a ballot initiative. And so I think we should allow that to take place, and allow that conversation to be had. As far as council, I think it's pretty split, and it's unfortunate that this issue is brought up in a time that we also have city council elections. So you have elections that are putting pressure on where you stand on certain issues, and how that is translated into something that can move the city forward in a way that, again, make sure that something like accountability and transparency are a priority for our city.
So another piece of polling that stood out to me was the support for alternatives to policing. Mm-hmm. And we saw that 64% of likely voters support replacing transit officers with civilian enforcement. 71% of likely voters support non-police community-based programs to prevent violence, and 64% of likely voters support the use of non-police responders to mental health related or substance use crises. And there was actually broad bipartisan support for all of these proposals. So it seems pretty clear that most people, regardless of what party they're a part of, understand that police shouldn't be the only responders to every issue, which is something that you mentioned a little bit earlier. So curious to hear, do you support these alternatives to policing? And if so, what can be done to move them forward?
Well, not only do I support these alternatives, we actually helped to create a couple of them already, and have shown them to be successful examples of what we should be doing. Just the other night, we had a council committee meeting late at night to discuss the mental health training program that SAPD does take on. It's very similar to many other municipalities. 40 hours of mental health training for police officers to help them in responding to issues. But what was very striking about the meeting was our own Department of Human Services was not in the meeting, and it was very disappointing. Because I think the bigger point is how much the city has pushed so much onto police and for police to handle, rather than getting the experts to go and help. In that same meeting, we had some outside entities, mental health experts that also agreed that there are better ways to do this. One of those is one that we created here in our office that is now citywide, is to create an outreach program, social outreach program, dealing with our people experiencing homelessness. And we believe that the strategy of outreach first is a better approach than to call the police and simply ask people who have no control of where they can be, to simply move along. We move them from point A to point B without building a relationship, without understanding what their issues are, and without knowing where they're supposed to go. And so we created this program because I believe in the connection and the issues that drive this are about building those relationships and that human connection that is more of a proactive approach. With police, it's more of a reactive, and I think we're asking to utilize tools that are really not meant to be tools that solve the issue, but rather give us comfort about maybe just sort of moving it along or getting it out of sight. But that doesn't solve anything. I believe that there are programs, and I'm convinced of it, in fact, that this city needs to invest more in our Department of Human Services. It needs to partner more with social outreach specialists. It needs to invest in social workers, in licensed clinicians, in helping to understand, how we should be meeting people where they're at, where are their issues, and proactively addressing that instead of policing that.
What are the barriers preventing this from happening? You mentioned that Health and Human Services didn't show up to this committee meeting. I'm wondering if there's some sort of systemic issue that's resulting in an inability to get this passed, or if there are other issues that you're seeing in terms of political buy-in, that sort of thing.
Well, there's several barriers, and it's part of it is just city management. The issue before us is that we are a city manager council form of government, and so many times, if the city manager simply wants something done, it just orders something done, it goes through. And so I think we become complacent about these issues. And as a council member, I take this role very seriously and believe that these are policy discussions. These are, as you pointed out, understanding where the community is and what the community is expecting of us is so critical. And so, having a step away from the status quo and what we've done for years and years and years just simply doesn't work. But that's what's happening. You have an apparatus. City management is basically a large group of people that have been with the city for many, many years, for over decades, and council members that may only be there for one term or a couple terms. And so that presents sort of an issue of continuity, an issue of understanding how to follow through on policy direction and directives. And so I believe that those are the biggest barriers that we've got to overcome, is that we as a council must highlight that the community is asking us to meet them where they're at. On top of that, the programs that we do have do create barriers and criminalize a lot of activity in order to then apply police to be the solution. I think we've got to step away from that. We've got to find ways to decriminalize activities or issues like people experiencing homelessness, because homelessness is not a crime. And so when we think about things like mental health and the issues that our city is facing, we've got to find a way to use different tools that are more proactive, again, and not find ways to criminalize or punish the community for being in crises.
Have you had conversations with the mayor about this? Where is the mayor stood when it comes to having alternatives to policing, decriminalizing homelessness, those sorts of things?
Well, it's unfortunate. I'm currently at my field office, and we're tackling this very issue right now with a population that we're seeing right here on our property, and we've been working with them, building relationships, getting them the help and support that they need. And most importantly, just being there for them. But these same folks are also being targeted by a small group of folks in this particular neighborhood. They want to criminalize this behavior, and they want to simply call them vagrants and want them hauled off. And I can tell you that again, being homeless is not a crime, but by making it a crime, it makes it it allows folks to utilize the police department to solve their problem, right? Which is just they don't want them in sight. And so we're facing that issue here. It's been a struggle to really work through this with a partnership with city management. Unfortunately, the mayor, this particular leadership in the neighborhood wrote to the mayor, and the mayor wrote back saying that he would increase policing in the area, which again, that's not what we're asking for. He didn't consult with me, so sadly we did not have that conversation. So I'm obviously very disappointed that we could not have a discussion about a place that I sit in this office, almost every single day, and know what's going on in this area, and know that there are better ways to handle this particular situation, and we're helping people is the bottom line.
Well, Council Member, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you for your time.
So it seems pretty clear that San Antonians want their city to do a better job of taking care of people's needs. They want the city to provide people with economic and mental health support to reduce their reliance on policing. And we've seen that this is possible. We've seen other cities been effective in implementing these sorts of changes. We've seen Stockton, California, which has been successful in providing for people's basic needs by giving their residents a guaranteed income. We've seen places like Anchorage, Los Angeles, Portland, and Denver that have all explored or piloted ways to have emergency first responders instead of police respond to mental health crises or to calls for social services. And so the model is out there, and the political will, clearly from this survey, shows that it's here. So in San Antonio, it's really a question of whether lawmakers are going to act upon the will of the people. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.